The sky blushed a deep orange as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the winding country road. The serenity of the moment was broken by the low growl of an approaching car, its headlights slicing through the twilight. Lee Hyun-suk gripped the steering wheel, his face a mask of frustration as he navigated the unfamiliar terrain. His phone buzzed incessantly on the passenger seat. Emails, reminders, calls he didn't want to take. The life of a CEO, constantly tethered to the chaos of responsibility, left him no room to breathe. Suddenly, a deer darted across the road. Startled, Hyun-seok jerked the wheel. The tires screeched against the asphalt as the car skidded dangerously close to the edge of the road. The last thing he remembered was the impact, a metallic crunch and the jarring sensation of being thrown forward. Then, darkness. Somewhere nearby, Kim Ji-ah stood outside her small veterinary clinic, wiping her hands on a worn apron. The evening air carried the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil and the faint chatter of villagers preparing for dinner. She glanced up at the sound of screeching tires, her brow furrowing. "That didn't sound good," she murmured to herself, quickly stepping inside to grab a flashlight. The road was quiet again when Ji-ah arrived, save for the rhythmic chirping of crickets. The beam of her flashlight swept across the scene, a luxury car tilted precariously in a shallow ditch, its front crumpled like paper. Her breath caught when she spotted the man inside. His face was pale under the streak of blood on his temple, his chest rising and falling faintly. "Hey, can you hear me?" Ji-ah called, her voice trembling as she yanked open the car door. The man groaned, his head lolling to the side. Up close, his features were striking despite his disheveled state. A sharp jawline, perfectly arched brows, and lips pressed in a grimace even in unconsciousness. With effort, she pulled him out, noting the expensive cut of his suit now smeared with dirt. "What are you doing all the way out here?" she muttered, more to herself than him. The man's weight was a struggle, but Ji-ah managed to half carry, half drag him to her small clinic. Inside, the clinic was warm and inviting, the scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint sweetness of lavender from a diffuser in the corner. Ji-ah laid him on the spare cot used for emergencies, her hands moving swiftly to check for broken bones or other injuries. He stirred slightly, his brow furrowing as if caught in a bad dream. "Don't worry. You're safe," she whispered, her voice soothing as she cleaned the cut on his forehead. Despite his unconscious state, there was something enigmatic about him, a sense of power, even in his vulnerability. Ji-ah couldn't help but wonder who he was, and what had brought him to this quiet corner of the world. Hours later, as the village settled into silence, Ji-ah sat beside him, exhaustion heavy on her shoulders. The man, still unconscious, looked so out of place in her humble clinic. His tailored suit and polished shoes spoke of wealth and a life far removed from her own, but there was a certain softness to his expression now, stripped of the tension that likely accompanied his waking hours. Ji-ah sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The quiet of the room was interrupted only by the rhythmic ticking of the clinic's clock and the distant hoot of an owl. Her gaze shifted to the man's hand, where a faint glint caught her eye. Carefully, she reached into his pocket, retrieving a ring engraved with elegant initials. LHS. "Who are you?" she whispered, her fingers brushing over the delicate carving. She placed the ring back where she'd found it, deciding it wasn't her place to pry. But as she watched him sleep, Ji-ah couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The night deepened, the stars above casting their pale light over the village. For now, the mystery of the man and his shattered car would remain unsolved. But Ji-ah knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. Morning light spilled through the wide windows of the clinic, painting soft golden patterns on the wooden floor. The air smelled faintly of lavender and freshly brewed tea, the kind Ji-ah always prepared to begin her day. She moved quietly around the room, checking on her patients. 2 dogs recovering from minor surgeries and a sleepy cat curled in a basket. Her gaze eventually fell on the man lying on the cot, his face still as pale as it had been the night before. He stirred slightly, his brows furrowing as if fighting off a persistent dream. Gia approached cautiously, her hand brushing against the edge of the cot as she leaned closer. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice carrying the same warmth she used with her patients. The man's eyelids fluttered open, revealing dark eyes that carried an intensity she wasn't prepared for. For a moment, he simply stared at her, confusion clouding his expression. Then his gaze darted around the room, taking in the quaint clinic and its assortment of animals. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're in my clinic," Gia explained, stepping back slightly to give him space. "You were in an accident last night. Do you remember anything?" The man frowned, his hand instinctively reaching for his temple, where a clean bandage now covered the wound. "An accident?" His voice trailed off as he searched his mind, but the blankness in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "Nothing?" Gia prompted gently. He shook his head slowly. "No, not even my name." Gia's heart twisted at his admission. Despite his commanding presence, there was a vulnerability in his voice that made him seem almost fragile. "That's okay," she said quickly. "Memory loss can happen after a head injury. It might come back with time." His lips pressed into a thin line, frustration flickering across his face. "Who found me?" "I did," Gia replied. "You were in pretty bad shape, but you'll recover. You're lucky it wasn't worse." The man exhaled, his gaze dropping to the blanket covering him. "Thank you for helping me." Gia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're welcome. Until you remember your name, we'll have to call you something." He looked up at her, one brow raised. "Something? How about Jun-ho?" she suggested. "It means handsome and brave. It suits you." A faint, almost reluctant smile crossed his lips, the first hint of emotion she'd seen since he woke up. "Jun-ho," he repeated, as if testing the sound. "I guess it'll do for now." As the day wore on, Gia introduced Jun-ho to the rhythms of her clinic. Despite his apparent disorientation, there was a sharpness in his observations, a certain precision in the way he took in his surroundings. He didn't belong here, that much was clear. His polished demeanor and the faint hint of an expensive cologne still clinging to his clothes suggested a man used to luxury, not the simplicity of a rural village. Gia caught him frowning at the rustic furnishings of the clinic more than once. "Not what you're used to?" she teased lightly, trying to ease the tension between them. "Not exactly," he admitted, his voice tinged with dry humor. They fell into a tentative rhythm over the next few hours. Gia tended to her patients while Jun-ho observed, occasionally asking questions. Despite his amnesia, he seemed naturally inquisitive, his sharp gaze missing nothing. Later, as Gia served them both a simple lunch of rice and vegetable soup, she noticed him glancing at the small details of the clinic, the framed photos of her family, the certificates from her veterinary school, the cheerful potted plants lining the windowsill. "This place," he began, his tone softer now, "feels peaceful." "It is," Gia agreed, sitting across from him. "The village is small, but it's home. Everyone knows everyone here. It's not the kind of place people usually pass through, though." Jun-ho didn't respond immediately, his expression growing distant. "I suppose I must have had a reason for being here," he said quietly, almost to himself. Gia's gaze drifted to the pocket where she'd found the engraved ring the night before. The initials LHS lingered in her mind, tempting her with questions she didn't dare voice. She wanted to trust this man, but the mystery of his identity made her hesitate. "You'll figure it out," she said instead, offering a reassuring smile. As the afternoon waned, Junho began to assist Jia with small tasks, surprising her with his competence. When she handed him a bowl of water for a limping dog, his hands were steady, his touch surprisingly gentle. Jia found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way his features softened when he focused on something outside himself. By evening, the clinic was bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Junho stood by the window, his silhouette framed against the vibrant colors of the sky. Jia hesitated before approaching him, the unspoken weight of his forgotten past hanging between them. "You'll remember," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "It'll come back to you." Junho turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "And if I don't?" Jia's heart skipped a beat at the vulnerability in his voice. "Then maybe it's not about what you've lost," she said softly. "Maybe it's about what you'll find." The soft hum of the clinic's fan filled the room as Jia carefully refilled a syringe, her movements practiced and precise. From his seat by the window, Junho, still adjusting to his temporary name, watched her in silence. The morning sun cast delicate rays over the clinic, highlighting the stray strands of hair that framed her face. There was something calming about her presence, an effortless grace that contrasted sharply with the fragmented chaos of his own mind. He didn't know who he was, or why he'd ended up in this small, unassuming village, but watching Jia move through her routine gave him a strange sense of stability. She worked with a quiet determination, her focus unwavering as she attended to her animal patients. "Would you like to help?" Jia's voice broke through his thoughts. She looked at him expectantly, holding a small basket filled with supplies. Junho hesitated. "Help? With feeding the dogs," she said with a gentle smile. "They'll warm up to you faster if you give them treats. Animals can sense kindness, you know." He scoffed lightly, though there was no malice in his tone. "I don't think I've been accused of being particularly kind before." Jia tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You don't seem unkind, just guarded." Her words lingered in the air as she handed him a bag of treats. Reluctantly, Junho crouched down beside the clinic's resident dogs, a pair of scruffy mutts named Dory and Hana. The animals eyed him warily at first, but the scent of the treats quickly won them over. As their wet noses brushed against his hands, Junho felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment. Jia watched him with a satisfied smile. "See? They like you." "Small victories," he murmured, though a faint smile tugged at his lips. Over the next few days, Junho began to involve himself more in the daily tasks of the clinic. At first, it was out of a sense of obligation. He felt indebted to Jia for her kindness. But as time went on, he found himself drawn to the simplicity of her world. The routine of feeding animals, organizing supplies, and assisting with minor procedures gave him a focus he hadn't realized he needed. The village, too, had its charm. The cobblestone paths wound through clusters of cottages adorned with blooming flowers. Children's laughter echoed from the open fields, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted from the small bakery near the square. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, high-pressure environment Junho instinctively associated with his past, though he couldn't remember it clearly. One evening, as the clinic settled into a peaceful quiet, Jia handed Junho a small, worn notebook. "What's this?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. "A journal," she explained. "I thought it might help. You can write down anything. Memories, thoughts, dreams. Sometimes putting things into words can bring clarity." Junho opened the notebook, running his fingers over the blank pages. For a moment, he felt a flicker of something. Gratitude, perhaps, or a faint sense of hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. Jia shrugged, though her smile was warm. "It's nothing, just don't expect it to write itself." Their connection grew in small, unspoken ways. Jia began to notice the subtle changes in Junho's demeanor, the way his shoulders seemed less tense, the faint traces of humor in his remarks, the way he lingered a little longer in conversations with her. For Junho, Jia was an enigma. She carried herself with quiet strength, yet there was a gentleness in her that he found disarming. He caught himself watching her more often than he should, wondering about the life she led in this idyllic village and what had shaped her into the person she was. One afternoon, as they worked side by side cleaning the clinic's storage room, Jia asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Do you think your old life was anything like this?" Junho paused, his hand resting on a stack of bandages. "I don't think so," he said slowly. "This place, it feels so far removed from whatever I came from." Jia nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's a good thing. Sometimes a fresh start can be a gift." Her words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. That night, as he sat by the window of the clinic, gazing out at the moonlit village, Junho opened the journal Jia had given him. For the first time, he let himself write. Fragments of thoughts, images that flickered in his mind, a sense of who he might have been. When Jia passed by and saw him engrossed in the notebook, she felt a small flutter of satisfaction. She didn't know why she cared so much about this stranger, or why his presence had become so significant to her. But as she watched him under the soft glow of the clinic's lantern, she realized that Junho wasn't just a mystery to be solved. He was someone she wanted to see whole again. Outside, the village settled into its usual nighttime hush, the stars casting a silver glow over the rooftops. Jia and Junho sat in their quiet corners, their thoughts worlds apart yet somehow tethered to each other. The early morning mist lingered over the village, curling through the fields and softening the edges of the cobblestone paths. Jia stepped outside the clinic, balancing a tray with 2 steaming cups of tea. The cool air prickled her skin, and she pulled her sweater tighter as her eyes wandered to Junho, sitting on the clinic's front steps. He had taken to spending his mornings there, staring at the horizon as though searching for something beyond it. Today, however, he wasn't alone. Dory, the scruffy mutt, rested his head on Junho's lap, his tail wagging lazily. Jia smiled at the sight, an involuntary warmth blooming in her chest. "Tea?" she called out, walking toward him. Junho glanced up, his dark eyes meeting hers. A small smile flickered across his lips, a gesture that was becoming more frequent. "Thanks," he said as she handed him a cup. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the faint chirping of birds filling the air. Jia watched as Junho absently stroked Dory's fur, his movements uncharacteristically tender. "You're getting good at this," Jia said, gesturing to the dog. "A few weeks ago, you barely wanted to touch him." Junho huffed a quiet laugh. "He grew on me," he admitted, taking a sip of his tea. "And you're relentless. I don't think I had much of a choice." Jia grinned. "You're welcome." Their mornings together became a routine, a rhythm that felt natural, despite the unusual circumstances of Junho's presence in her life. He began to accompany her on errands around the village, helping carry supplies or chatting with the villagers. Though he was polite, there was still an air of reservation about him. A subtle reminder that he was a man out of place, trying to fit into a world that wasn't his own. One afternoon, Jia suggested they visit a nearby field, where she often gathered medicinal herbs. The walk was long, the dirt path winding through a dense forest before opening into a sprawling meadow. Wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted greens of the surrounding hills. Junho followed her lead, his steps purposeful but cautious, as if he were still growing accustomed to the uneven terrain. Jia knelt by a cluster of lavender, her fingers deftly plucking the stems. "You can help, you know," she said, glancing up at him. Junho hesitated before crouching beside her. "I'm not sure I'll be much help. I don't exactly have a green thumb." Just pick the ones that look like this, Jia instructed, holding up a sprig of lavender. For a while they worked in silence, the soft rustling of leaves and the hum of distant cicadas filling the air. Jia stole a glance at Junho, noting the way the sunlight caught in his hair, making it appear almost golden. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms that, despite his polished demeanor, hinted at a life that hadn't always been easy. "You're a fast learner," Jia said, as he placed a bundle of lavender into her basket. Junho gave a slight shrug. "You're a decent teacher." There was a pause before he added, "It's peaceful here. I don't think I've ever spent this much time in one place before." Jia looked at him. Her curiosity piqued. "You must have traveled a lot then." "Maybe," he said, his gaze distant. "I don't remember. But I feel like I was always chasing something, never stopping long enough to see what was right in front of me." Jia's chest tightened at his words, the raw honesty in them catching her off guard. She wanted to ask more, but decided against it, sensing that this was as much as he was willing to share. On their way back to the village, they stopped by a shallow stream to rest. Jia knelt by the water, letting it cool her hands while Junho sat on a nearby rock, his gaze fixed on the rippling surface. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to start over?" he asked suddenly. Jia turned to him, surprised by the question. "Start over?" "Yeah," he said, his tone contemplative. "No past, no expectations, just a clean slate." Jia considered his words. "I think it depends. Starting over can be freeing, but it can also be scary. You lose the things that make you who you are." Junho nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what I need," he murmured, "to figure out who I really am without all the noise." Their conversation stayed with Jia long after they returned to the clinic. She found herself watching Junho more closely, noticing the subtle shifts in his demeanor. The way he seemed more at ease with the animals, the way his smiles came a little easier, the way he lingered in her company as though reluctant to leave. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat on the porch of the clinic, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. "You've changed," Jia said softly. Junho turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "Changed how?" "You're not as guarded," she explained. "When you first got here, it was like there was this wall around you. But now—" She trailed off, her cheeks warming under his steady gaze. "Maybe it's because of you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a sincerity that made her breath catch. The moment hung between them, delicate and unspoken, until the distant sound of laughter from the village square broke the spell. Jia glanced away, her heart pounding. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if Junho's presence in her life was more than just a twist of fate. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the cobblestone path as Jia finished tending to a recovering puppy in her clinic. She barely had time to look up before the door swung open. Standing there, framed by the golden afternoon light, was a woman who seemed to carry an air of authority and elegance that didn't belong in the village. Jia's first impression was of her striking appearance. Sharp features softened by impeccable makeup, a tailored cream blazer that hugged her figure, and heels that clicked against the clinic's floor as she stepped inside. She exuded confidence, but her eyes held something Jia couldn't quite place. "Is he here?" the woman asked, her voice calm but tinged with urgency. Jia blinked, momentarily at a loss. "I'm sorry. Who are you looking for?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Her gaze swept the room before settling on Jia with a look of quiet determination. "Lee Hyun-seok. I believe you've been calling him Junho." Jia froze, the name crashing into her like a wave. Her lips parted in disbelief. You know him?" The woman nodded. "I'm Oh Yoon-byul, his associate." Her voice softened slightly as she added, "We've been looking for him for weeks." At that moment, Junho, or rather Hyun-seok, appeared in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and unease. His gaze locked onto Yoon-byul, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition. Hyun-seok, Yoon-byul breathed, relief washing over her features. Hyun-seok stepped forward slowly, his brows furrowing. I've seen you before, he said cautiously, as if testing the memory. Yes, Yoon-byul said, her tone steady but filled with emotion. I'm your colleague, your friend. You've been missing since the accident. Jia stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest as she watched the exchange. She felt the ground shift beneath her, the fragile sense of stability she had built with Junho, Hyun-seok, crumbling into uncertainty. I don't remember much, Hyun-seok admitted, his voice quiet but laced with frustration. Bits and pieces, maybe, but nothing concrete. Yoon-byul took a tentative step closer. It's okay, she said gently. We'll help you, but you need to come back. There's so much waiting for you. Your life, your work. People need you. The room seemed to close in on Jia as those words hung in the air. She felt a pang deep in her chest, the reality of the situation hitting her with full force. He wasn't Junho, the man who had found a temporary place in her quiet world. He was Lee Hyun-seok, someone who belonged to a completely different life. Hyun-seok's gaze shifted to Jia, and for a moment, the unspoken connection between them felt like a lifeline. I don't know if I'm ready to go back, he said, his voice low but firm. Yoon-byul's expression faltered briefly before she recovered. I understand, she said, though her tone carried a hint of impatience. But this isn't where you belong. You've worked too hard to build your life to let it slip away. Jia looked away, unable to meet either of their eyes. She busied herself tidying the already neat clinic, her hands trembling slightly. Later that evening, Yoon-byul stayed at a guest house in the village, giving Hyun-seok space to think. Jia, meanwhile, tried to distract herself by tending to the animals, but her mind kept returning to the encounter. When Hyun-seok finally approached her, the moon had risen high, casting a silver glow over the clinic's small yard. He found her sitting on the steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly, sitting beside her. Jia didn't look at him. Because you didn't remember, and I didn't want to push you away. I thought you deserved a chance to figure things out on your own. Hyun-seok sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to do, Jia. That woman, she knows things about me, things I don't even know about myself. But when I think about leaving here, it feels wrong. Jia's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. She's right, though. This isn't your life. You don't belong here. Hyun-seok turned to her, his expression conflicted. And what if I want to belong here? The words sent a shock through Jia's system, her heart stuttering in her chest. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. Don't say things like that. It's not fair. Why not? He asked, his voice rising slightly. Everything I've felt here, everything I've felt with you, it's real, isn't it? Jia looked at him then, her resolve crumbling. It is, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But real doesn't mean it's enough. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of unspoken emotions hung heavy in the air, their gazes locked in a silent plea for understanding. Finally, Hyun-seok broke the silence. If I leave, he said slowly, I don't think I'll be the same person who came here. Maybe that's the point, Jia replied, her voice trembling. Maybe you're supposed to find yourself by leaving, not staying. Hyun-seok exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping. Jia wanted to reach out, to hold him, to tell him everything would be okay. But she knew it wasn't her place anymore. As Hyun-seok rose and walked back toward the guest house where Yoon-byul was waiting, Jia remained on the steps, tears streaming silently down her face. The morning air was heavy with unspoken tension. The usual cheer of the village seemed muted, as if the world had sensed the emotional storm brewing in the hearts of its inhabitants. Jia moved through her clinic with mechanical precision, her thoughts weighed down by the events of the previous day. Every time she looked at the empty cot where Junho, Hyunseok, had once rested, a pang of loss struck her. Outside, Hyunseok stood in the guest house garden, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yoonbyul approached cautiously, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. She observed him in silence for a moment before speaking. "You're conflicted," she said, her tone both understanding and firm. Hyunseok turned to her, his brows furrowing. "Of course I am. I don't know who I am anymore. This place, this life. It's changed me." Yoonbyul's expression softened. "You've always been driven, Hyunseok. Even before the accident, you carried the weight of your responsibilities on your shoulders. That hasn't changed. You just need to remember why you started in the first place." Her words struck a chord, but they didn't ease the turmoil within him. Hyunseok thought of Jia, of her quiet strength, and the way she had shown him a side of life he'd never known. The contrast between her world and the one Yoonbyul spoke of was stark, and he wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher, Hyunsuk walked back to the clinic. He found Jia tending to a lamb, her hands gentle and precise as she wrapped a bandage around its leg. She didn't look up when he entered, but he knew she was aware of his presence. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Jia's movement stilled for a moment before she resumed her work. "Go ahead." Hyunseok hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Yoonbyul thinks I should go back. She says it's my duty." Jia set the lamb down gently and straightened, finally meeting his gaze. "She's right," she said, her voice calm but distant. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, stepping closer. "What I believe doesn't matter," Jia replied, her tone firm. "This isn't about me. It's about you." Hyunsuk exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling to the surface. "You keep saying that, but I can't help feeling like you're pushing me away." "Because I am," Jia said, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't belong here, Hyunseok. You never did, and staying here won't change that." The raw honesty in her words cut through him like a blade. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the truth in her eyes stopped him. "You've given me so much," Hyunseok said softly. "More than you'll ever know. But I don't think I can leave this place without leaving a part of myself behind." Jia's heart twisted at his words, tears threatening to spill. "Then take that part of yourself and use it to make your life better," she said, her voice trembling. "But don't stay here out of guilt or confusion. It wouldn't be fair to either of us." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the clinic door. Yoonbyul entered, her presence commanding as always. She glanced between the two of them, sensing the heavy emotions in the room. "Hyunseok," she said gently. "It's time." Hyunseok looked at Jia one last time, his expression a mixture of gratitude and regret. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jia nodded, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She watched as he walked away, each step feeling like a wound opening wider in her chest. That night, the village was quiet, the usual sounds of laughter and music absent. Jia sat alone in the clinic, staring at the small notebook Hyunsuk had left behind. She opened it hesitantly, her eyes scanning the pages filled with fragments of his thoughts. One sentence stood out. "I found myself in the quiet moments." Tears blurred her vision as she closed the notebook, clutching it to her chest. She knew she had done the right thing, but the ache in her heart made it hard to breathe. Meanwhile, Hyun-seok and Yoon-byul boarded a car that would take them back to the city. As they drove away, Hyun-seok's gaze remained fixed on the rearview mirror, the image of the village growing smaller until it disappeared completely. Yoon-byul broke the silence. "You'll find your footing again," she said, her voice steady. Hyun-seok didn't respond. His thoughts were consumed by the life he had left behind, not the one in the city, but the one he had briefly found in the little village with Jia. As the car sped through the darkened countryside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was leaving behind more than just a place. He was leaving behind a version of himself he wasn't sure he could ever fully reclaim. The city loomed ahead, a forest of steel and glass glowing against the inky night. Hyun-seok sat silently in the back seat of the car, his reflection flickering in the window like a ghost. The closer they got to the towering skyline, the heavier his chest felt. His world, once familiar and secure, now seemed alien, suffocating. Yoon-byul, seated beside him, glanced at him cautiously. "We've prepared everything for your return," she said, her tone measured. "Your office is waiting, and the board has been briefed about your recovery." Hyun-seok barely nodded, his mind elsewhere. The memory of Jia lingered, her tear-filled eyes and trembling voice playing on a loop. He clenched his fists, trying to suppress the ache in his chest. The notebook he had started in the village rested in his lap, its pages filled with thoughts he hadn't dared to share aloud. As they pulled into the underground parking lot of his company's headquarters, the hum of the city vibrated in the air. Yoon-byul stepped out first, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement. Hyun-seok followed reluctantly, his gaze sweeping the towering building that bore his name. Inside, the familiar environment of polished floors, sleek furniture, and bustling staff greeted him. Heads turned as he walked through the lobby, whispers of relief and curiosity trailing in his wake. Yet, the once reassuring atmosphere now felt oppressive. In his office, the space was exactly as he had left it, immaculate and impersonal. Yoon-byul placed a stack of documents on his desk. "Your schedule for the week," she said, her voice softening. "It's a lot, but we can adjust if you're not ready." Hyun-seok picked up a pen, his fingers tightening around it. "I'll manage," he replied curtly. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and obligations. Hyun-seok played his role flawlessly, masking the inner turmoil that threatened to consume him. But every moment in the boardroom, every polite conversation with a client, felt like a betrayal of the man he had begun to discover in the village. Late one evening, as the city buzzed below him, Hyun-seok sat alone in his office. He opened the notebook Jia had given him, his eyes scanning the familiar pages. One phrase caught his attention. "I found peace in her world." The words hit him like a tidal wave. The village had given him more than refuge. It had given him clarity. Jia had shown him a version of himself he hadn't known existed, one unburdened by power and expectation. The decision formed in his mind with startling clarity. He couldn't stay here, couldn't pretend that this life, the life he had fought so hard to build, was enough anymore. The following morning, Hyun-seok walked into a meeting with the board, his suit impeccably tailored, his expression calm but resolute. The room quieted as he stood at the head of the table, his commanding presence drawing every gaze. "I want to thank all of you for your support during my absence," he began, his voice steady. "But I've come to realize that I can no longer lead this company in the way it deserves." Murmurs of shock rippled through the room, but Hyun-seok held up a hand to silence them. "This company has been my life's work, and I'm proud of what we've achieved. But I've changed. My priorities have changed." Yoon-byul's expression was unreadable, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had always known Hyun-seok as an unstoppable force, a man who thrived under pressure. But now, the determination in his voice was different, quieter, yet unyielding. After the meeting, Yoon-byul confronted him in his office. "You're really leaving?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hyun-seok nodded. I have to. This place, it's not who I am anymore. And Jia, Yunbyul pressed. A faint smile tugged at his lips. She's part of the reason I'm doing this. I need to go back, not just for her, but for myself. Yunbyul looked away, her composure faltering for the first time. I hope you find what you're looking for, she said, her tone laced with both pain and acceptance. That evening, Hyun-seok boarded a train bound for the village. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks mirrored the steady beat of his heart, filled with anticipation and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. When he arrived, the village was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. He walked the familiar paths, his steps quickening as he approached the clinic. The sight of it, warm light spilling from the windows, the faint hum of life inside, filled him with a bittersweet ache. Ji-ah was in the yard, tending to a garden bed of vibrant flowers. She froze when she saw him, her eyes widening in disbelief. You came back, she said, her voice trembling. Hyun-seok stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. I came back because I couldn't stay away. Because this place, it's where I'm meant to be. The weight of his words settled between them, and Jia felt her carefully built walls begin to crumble. You don't have to say that, she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. I'm not saying it because I have to, Hyun-seok replied. I'm saying it because it's the truth. The moment stretched, charged with unspoken emotion. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Jia stepped into his arms, her tears falling freely as he held her close. For the first time in weeks, Hyun-seok felt whole. The village greeted the new day with a tranquil hum. Morning mist lingered over the fields, kissed by the pale light of the rising sun. Jia stood at the clinic's window, watching as Hyun-seok moved through the yard with a deliberate calm. His presence felt surreal, both a comfort and a reminder of how much her world had changed since he first appeared. He knelt beside Dory, scratching the dog's ears as though it was the most natural thing in the world. There was a softness in his movements, a stark contrast to the man she had first met, the one who had been guarded, distant, and unknowable. Jia's heart ached as she turned away from the window. She had never dared to hope he would return, and now that he had, she wasn't sure what it meant for either of them. Hyun-seok appeared in the doorway moments later, his presence filling the small room. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand, their petals vibrant against his crisp white shirt. For you, he said simply, holding them out. Jia hesitated before accepting them, her fingers brushing his briefly. You didn't have to. I wanted to, he replied, his gaze steady. I needed to. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Jia gestured to the table. I was just about to make tea. Will you join me? Hyun-seok nodded, following her to the small kitchen area. As she busied herself with the tea, he watched her, his thoughts turning inward. The life he had left behind felt like a distant memory now, a shadow of a man he no longer recognized. When the tea was ready, they sat across from each other at the modest wooden table. Jia's fingers toyed with the rim of her cup as she searched for the right words. You left everything behind, she said finally, her voice soft. Why? Hyun-seok met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. Because none of it mattered as much as this place. As much as you. Jia's breath caught. She looked away, her cheeks warming under his intense gaze. You don't have to say that, she murmured. I'm not saying it to convince you, Hyun-seok said firmly. I'm saying it because it's the truth. This village, this life, it's where I've found myself. And you're the reason I realized that. Tears pricked Jia's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. It's not that simple, she said, her voice trembling. You can't just leave everything behind for me. I didn't leave it for you, he corrected gently. I left it for me. You showed me what life could be, what it should be. And now I want to build that life here, with you. The raw honesty in his words broke through Jia's defenses. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as it rested on his. I'm scared, she admitted. I am too, Hyunseok said, his fingers closing around hers. But I'd rather be scared with you than live a life that feels empty. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the clinic door. Jia withdrew her hand quickly, composing herself before opening it. Standing there was Yoon-byul, her expression poised but subdued. I hope I'm not intruding, Yoon-byul said, her gaze flickering between Jia and Hyunseok. Not at all, Jia replied, stepping aside to let her in. Yoon-byul entered, her sharp heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. She held a small box in her hands, her movements deliberate as she approached Hyunseok. I wanted to say goodbye, she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. And to give you this. Hyunseok took the box from her, his brows furrowing as he opened it. Inside was the ring Jia had found in his pocket the night of the accident. It belongs to you, Yoon-byul said. And so does your life, whatever you choose to make of it now. Hyunseok's throat tightened as he looked at her. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet. Yoon-byul nodded, her composure wavering for just a moment. I hope you find what you're looking for. She turned to leave, but Jia stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm. Thank you, Jia said sincerely. Yoon-byul offered a faint smile before walking out, her figure disappearing into the golden light of the village. Hyunseok closed the box, his fingers lingering over the engraved initials. He turned to Jia, his expression both determined and vulnerable. This doesn't define me anymore, he said, holding up the ring. But it's a part of who I was, and I want to carry that with me into the life I build here, with you. Jia felt her heart swell, the fear that had gripped her loosening its hold. She stepped closer to him, her eyes searching his for any sign of doubt. Instead, she found only certainty. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We'll figure it out, together. The sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the clinic in a warm, golden glow. Outside, the sounds of the village filled the air. Children's laughter, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the steady rhythm of life moving forward. Hyunseok and Jia stood side by side, their hands entwined as they looked out at the world that had brought them together. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The clinic hummed with quiet activity as Jia finished preparing a fresh batch of herbal remedies. Outside, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the village. It had been days since Hyunseok had made his decision to stay, and while Jia felt a fragile peace growing between them, the weight of the future still pressed heavily on her heart. Hyunseok walked in from the yard, his sleeves rolled up and his hands streaked with dirt from helping a neighbor repair a fence. He had thrown himself into village life with surprising enthusiasm, eager to prove that his choice to stay wasn't just a fleeting impulse. Yet Jia could see the flickers of uncertainty in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. You've been busy, she remarked, her tone light but tinged with affection. He offered a small smile, brushing his hands on a towel. I figured it's time I start pulling my weight around here. Jia laughed softly, but the sound didn't fully reach her eyes. Hyunseok noticed, stepping closer. What's wrong? He asked gently. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter. I'm happy you're here, she said finally. But I can't help wondering, will it last? Or will the life you left behind come calling again? Hyunseok's expression softened as he reached for her hand. Jia, he said, his voice steady. I've already made my choice. That world doesn't hold anything for me anymore. You do. Before Jia could respond, there was a knock at the door. She turned, startled, and opened it to find Yunbul standing there once again. This time, Yunbul's demeanor was different. Less composed, more vulnerable. Her sharp features seemed softened by the faint sheen of tears in her eyes, though she still carried herself with the grace of someone who had long practiced hiding her emotions. I hope I'm not interrupting, Yunbul said, her voice quiet. Not at all, Jia replied, stepping aside to let her in. Hyun-seok's gaze met Yunbul's, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Yunbul gave a small, wistful smile. I didn't think I'd come back either, but I needed to. She pulled a folded envelope from her bag, handing it to Hyun-seok. This is my resignation, she said. I've decided to step down from my position at the company. Hyun-seok's brows furrowed in confusion. Why? You don't need to do this because of me. Yunbul shook her head. It's not because of you. It's because of me. Watching you leave made me realize that I've been holding on to a life that doesn't make me happy either. I thought power and success would fill the emptiness, but they never did. Jia watched the exchange silently, her heart aching for the woman who had always seemed so composed and in control. Yunbul turned to Jia, her smile faint but genuine. I wanted to thank you, she said, for helping Hyun-seok find what he needed, even when it must have been difficult for you. Jia nodded, her throat tightening. You didn't have to come all this way, she said softly. I did, Yunbul replied. I needed closure, and I wanted to leave this with you. She handed Jia a small box, its surface smooth and polished. Jia opened it carefully, her breath catching when she saw the engraved ring inside, the one Hyun-seok had once carried. It's a part of his past, Yunbul explained. But it doesn't define him anymore. I thought it should stay here, with the life he's chosen now. Hyun-seok stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the ring. He took it from the box, turning it over in his fingers before slipping it into his pocket. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity that made Yunbul's composure falter. I hope you're happy, Yunbul said, her voice trembling slightly. Both of you. With that, she turned and walked out, her figure disappearing into the warm glow of the village streets. Hyun-seok turned to Jia, his expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. She's right, he said. This ring, it's a part of who I was, but it's not who I am anymore. And I want to build my life with you, Jia. Jia felt her eyes well with tears, but this time they were tears of hope. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Then let's build it, she whispered. Together. They stood there in the clinic, the quiet warmth of the evening wrapping around them like a promise. For the first time, the future felt less like a question and more like a gift, something they could create, one moment at a time. The village awoke to the soft murmur of life, the distant crow of a rooster, and the rustle of leaves carried by the morning breeze. The clinic, now bathed in golden sunlight, buzzed with quiet energy as Jia prepared for the day. A sense of renewal filled the air, as though the world itself had decided to mirror the transformation taking place within her. Hyun-seok appeared at the door, his sleeves rolled up, and a slight smudge of dirt on his cheek, a testament to the morning he had spent helping repair the roof of the bakery. His presence no longer felt like an interruption to Jia's world, but an integral part of it, as natural as the sun rising each day. Good morning, he said, his voice carrying an easy warmth that made Jia smile. Good morning, she replied, handing him a cup of tea. You look like you've been busy. He chuckled, brushing a hand over his face. I think I'm starting to get the hang of this village life. Jia tilted her head, her smile widening. You're doing better than most newcomers. Maybe you were meant for this all along. Hyunseok's gaze softened as he looked at her. Maybe I was. Or maybe I just needed to find the right reason to stay. The words hung between them, unspoken promises woven into the quiet intimacy of the moment. Jia's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief that this man, who had once seemed so untouchable, had chosen her and her world over everything else. The day passed in a blur of tasks and laughter. Villagers stopped by the clinic, not just for help with their animals, but to chat and share stories. Hyunseok moved among them effortlessly, his once rigid demeanor replaced with an openness that made him seem like he had always belonged. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Jia and Hyunseok stood side by side in the clinic's garden. They worked together to plant a new row of flowers, their hands brushing occasionally as they dug into the soft earth. "Do you think it'll grow well here?" Hyunseok asked, holding up a small lavender plant. Jia smiled, brushing dirt from her hands. "With enough care, anything can grow." Hyunseok looked at her, a quiet understanding passing between them. "You taught me that," he said softly. Jia's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "You taught me too," she replied, "that it's okay to hope for something more." The garden, now freshly planted, seemed to reflect their shared journey, a mix of hard work, patience, and the belief that something beautiful could take root even in unexpected places. As the evening deepened, the villagers gathered for a small festival in the square, celebrating the harvest season. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, their golden light casting a warm glow over the lively scene. Hyunseok and Jia arrived together, their presence greeted with smiles and laughter. It was a moment of quiet triumph for Jia to see him so at ease, mingling with the people who had once regarded him as an outsider. Midway through the festivities, Hyunseok led Jia away from the crowd to a quiet spot near the river. The water shimmered under the moonlight, its gentle ripples reflecting the stars above. "I wanted to give you something," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Jia's breath caught as he opened it, revealing the engraved ring Yunbyul had returned to him. "This used to be a symbol of who I thought I had to be," he said, his voice steady. "But now it's a reminder of who I've become, and I want you to have it. Not as something to bind us to the past, but as a promise of the future I want to build with you." Tears welled in Jia's eyes as she reached for the ring, her fingers trembling. "You don't have to promise me anything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," Hyunseok replied, taking her hand and sliding the ring onto her finger. "But I want to. Because you've given me more than I ever thought I could have. Peace, purpose, and love." Jia couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder as he held her close. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the river and the steady rhythm of their hearts. When they returned to the village square, hand in hand, the festival was in full swing. Lanterns illuminated their path as they joined the others, their smiles radiant and unguarded. As the night wore on, they stood together at the edge of the square, watching as children chased each other with sparklers and elders laughed over cups of warm tea. Jia leaned into Hyunseok's side, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't ended up here?" she asked quietly. Hyunseok smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "All the time, and every time, I thank whatever fate brought me to you." The night stretched on, filled with music, laughter, and the quiet certainty that they had found their place in the world, together.